Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday, April 5th, and super excited for this conversation today around here at Vote Common Good in our overall work, and especially on the Common Good Podcast. We like to talk about how we can find ways to pursue the common good together, how we can get over the polarization that exists and tears us apart. And sometimes we can find some of the fingerprints in the crime scene of polarization. And far too often, I will say, it is religion. And that strikes me pretty harsh because I've spent my life in the religious world and the religious communities and trying to build religion and religious practice and faith as a positive element in our world. And yet, boy, so often the faiths that we profess and believe should call us together end up taking us apart. And certainly true in the evangelical world that I come from, that community has far too often been guilty of a lot of separation. And it's also true in the Catholic community. And that's why we're so glad to have Father Aaron Wessman with us today. And he has written a book on this very topic. So, Father Aaron, really good to have you with us today and chatting about how we can find a way forward that does really include all of us and not just some of us.
Yeah, that's great, Doug. It's really wonderful to be with you, and it's great to be on the show. So thank you so much.
All right, so you have taken not only your fatherly duties as a priest and a theologian and a writer and a thinker, but you decided to write a book about polarization. This book of the church's mission in a polarized world, certainly timely. What got you into writing? Why did you decide that a book was the way you wanted to address this issue?
That's a great question to start out with. So I had an opportunity to live in Belgium for about 3 or 4 years. My religious community, which is the Glenmary Home Missioners, sent me over to Belgium to study at the Catholic University of Louvain to work on a PhD in systematic theology. And so from about the years of 2014 to roughly 2018, I was living abroad, if you will. And having a chance to be in Europe, I kind of immersed myself in European culture and history and tradition, and of course my PhD studies. And so, in one sense, I was kind of sheltered a little bit from what was going on in the United States.
Wow.
I wasn't following as much as I normally would the political or cultural situation back in the U.S. And in one sense, that was kind of a nice reprieve. It was actually kind of really a gift that I was given by being able to study there. So I came back to the United States after about 4 years there. And it was like a ton of bricks actually hitting me. It was obvious to me when I came back in the US that something had changed. And that something was very complex and complicated, but I saw that what I understood to be polarization before I had left seemingly had intensified, particularly the negativity that was existing within the country. I saw it in conversations that were happening very much locally. So conversations around me with folks, perhaps within my extended family, for instance, people within the parishes where I was serving, and then at large within the Glenmary community, within the Catholic world, I saw some of what was happening. And interestingly, I'm like, what is going on here? What has happened? What has changed? And I kind of thought naively that I could sort of stay above the fray, if you will. And I'm like, I've had a great experience of being able to study. It's kind of that maybe a little bit of an arrogance, if you will. I thought, I'm not going to get sucked down into this. And really within weeks, I found myself getting kind of pulled into the negativity. And so what that meant was, like, for myself, I'm like, why am I getting so upset when a particular church official would speak, from let's say a particular theological perspective, or, when a certain politician was mentioned on the news, and I'm like, this was not part of my experience over the last 3 or 4 years while I was living in Europe, but clearly I'm being kind of sucked down into what I would call the storms of polarization. So I wanted really, as a personal journey, to figure out what was going on inside of me. I also saw within my family, extended family, within the parish that I was serving, within the broader society and Catholic world, that something had happened, and people were really affected by it. They really felt the emotions related to polarization, and I think in a very intimate and personal way, they saw what was happening with their friends and in their family. So I set out to study this topic on my own. And then as I was studying and as I was sort of presenting on this in different retreats and different spaces, somewhere along the line, somebody said, Father Aaron, you should really think about writing a book on this. And I'm like, I've got enough responsibilities. I'm doing a lot of other things. And then I started to take that to heart. And I thought,
Mm.
maybe because the people I'm talking to find this interesting, sometimes they're moved to tears because what's going on in their own lives and their families. Maybe this could provide some kind of a hope or perhaps a way out for some of the vitriol that was taking place. So I set myself to write this book, and that's kind of how this came about.
Well, it's certainly important work. And look, none of us should try to fool ourselves into thinking that the world used to be a place of commonality and unity and shared narrative and things worked well. And then something went wrong, recently. We have seen in the world's history great levels of division,
Mm.
tribal divisions, religious divisions. With both of us coming from the Christian traditions, we also root ourselves or sort of nest ourselves like Ukrainian resting dolls, inside of the Jewish text, right, in the Jewish community. So we share a common scripture, and in the book of Genesis, it starts with this story of the Son of God and the family of God, and Adam and Eve kind of story, and then they have two sons in that telling, and one of them kills the other,
Yeah.
right? And it's sort of like you're reminded that there's been this experience of humanity that trans is over time and over space and different places, kind of reminding you that whatever we're into now, the divisions that we have are particular and important, and we should address them because we're always in a local moment. And whatever was going on 3,000, 5,000 years ago when people wanted to tell those stories and tell those tales is not exactly our same situation. So there's something in us that causes us to polarize and to separate. And, depending on how one reads that Genesis passage, it might be, the believing that God doesn't accept one the way God accepts the other, and that turns to violence of the brothers on brothers. If people haven't read that story, you only have to read a few chapters into the book of Genesis, and they're not real book chapters, they're Bible chapters, so they're quite short. But you get this story rather quickly. So, like this thing you're writing about, this thing we're talking about, this work that we do in our worlds of common good, uh, it's really deeply rooted, isn't it? This tendency to polarize and separate and enslave and keep some people here and some people there. You thinking about that stuff too? I mean, and we'll talk about the details of the book, but just sort of overall, like it's really a big project, isn't it? To have to consider what do we do about this root polarization that just seems so easy to fall into.
Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of great points there, and I'm in agreement with you. I mean, I think you look back over the history of humanity in many cases, and it's sadly a history of certain types of alienation, certain types of division, angst between people. I have a phrase that I use in the book called original fragility, kind of
Wow.
going back to that original story, um,
Nice.
where there's a kind of fragility that happens within human beings because we become separated from each other, and in a sense, rather than moving to become more united, we sort of work out of that fragility and we create deeper divisions. And we start sort of amplifying this us versus them mentality. And you can see it, of course, with the various stories in the Bible of murder and division and betrayal and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's a struggle that transcends this particular moment. And then, like you mentioned, there are I think specific aspects of a cultural moment that can either
Hmm.
amplify or assist or help or problematize the moment that we're in. So that's exactly what I set out to try to do it in a very small way, but hopefully a meaningful way in the book that I wrote.
All right. So, in the book, you make a couple of suggestions. It's structured where there's sort of the beginning is what is this polarization, and what are some ways that we can think about understanding it, right? Knowing that it's both personal, interpersonal, political, religious, sports teams, and I don't say that lightly. Like there are places in the world where people turn to physical altercations and violence against each other in sporting events, right? Like they really,
Oh,
like, like Europe is one of those places, right? Which maybe you saw too. People take it. I mean, it's you're beyond just who you root for. There's a core identity of existence, and so like human beings have these capacities. So what is it that creates that? You write about this in the book. What is it that creates that circumstance? Then you have a bit, and I want to talk about all these pieces, um, where you're really bold as a as a working father in the Catholic community to say, look, the church and religion hasn't always been the solution to these problems. We have been in our lifetime and currently now, our religious traditions sometimes are the problem and are the ones, and we have metaphors that we use, especially a holy war metaphor, which is really harmful and damaging. And then you move on to, so what are some other options and how is it that people are working in the world? Do I have the structure of the book pretty much right? Did I miss any of the important pieces in there?
Yeah, you do, Doug, and I appreciate your careful look at the book, and that's exactly kind of the three moves that take place within the book.
All right. So is that a good order to go in, or are you like, hey, when I actually talk about this book, I like to talk about those in a different order, or are those the order, because they're, I know that sometimes, the way any of us who write books, structure books is not always the way we would talk about it. There's just kind of a book deal, on how readers want to sort of move through a set of ideas. Do you want to talk about those three in that
Sure,
order? Talk about
that would be
polarization first.
wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. So for those who haven't yet read the book, talk about what these conditions of polarization are. The way we find ourselves hibernating in certain communities and isolated from one another, and some of the rest of it. Remind us what your take is on how we become so increasingly polarized.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the first third of the book, really, I try my best to take research from various disciplines in various fields. So I'm looking at sociological studies and sociology. I'm looking at social psychology and psychology in general. I'm looking at certain tendencies within history and political science, philosophy, and in theology, and it's really to try to answer the question, so what is polarization? And I think it's important to point out to folks that this is a super complex issue. A recent book that came out by Peter Coleman, the book is called The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. He teaches at Columbia University. It's a wonderful book, and one of the pages in the book that I love, in one of the first few chapters, he lists this grand list of all of the causes and contours of polarization. He comes up with over 50. Um, so we're talking about this massively complex issue, and I felt like I could in my own humble way add even a few things to what he talked about, especially thinking theologically from my perspective as a theologian. So I tried to boil down the challenge of polarization into three contours. And I think it's important to point out that these contours have been developing in society, which then affects all of what's in society in
Mm.
America. So it also affects the church and our families and our politics and so on. They've been developing for the last probably 50 or 60 years. So people who study polarization say we kind of want to look at about 60 years ago and see how trends have actually changed in the United States to produce the situation that we have today. And I think what this did for me, and I think it does for others, is it does give us a little bit of a historical perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
I find it allows me to take a breath of air, right? So it's not one event that's taken place over the last couple of years. It's not one politician or one party, but in fact, this is a culmination of things that has been happening in the U.S. for really quite a number of decades. And so that, I think, provides us a little bit of space to think critically about what's happening. So the three contours that I look at are what I call sorting, homogenization, and then intensification. And I'll just take and maybe go through each of these,
Yeah.
not in detail, but just kind of in a summary way. So the first is sorting, and what people often refer to as a classic text in this regard, that is Bill Bishop's The Big Sort.
The big sort. Yeah.
And Bishop is really phenomenal. And he basically says, look, over the last 50 or 60 years, the United States became far more mobile than we ever were. That was because of roads and because of cars and technology and new jobs and so on and so forth. So people made decisions about where to live throughout the United States. And some of these decisions, of course, as Bishop notes, were very political in nature. Let's say, you saw yard signs in a neighborhood that you felt like you could, agree with. But some of these decisions were just kind of like cultural and religious and perhaps even racial. We sorted into regions where we felt like we could perhaps feel at home or feel comfortable, so on and so forth. So what happened is over the last number of decades, we created two massive groups throughout the United States. And these groups are different geographically. So it is just statistically speaking, now I'm generalizing with the statistics, but statistically speaking, we have created a kind of urban and rural divide. We've also created a perhaps coastal and a heartland divide. And what looks like a divide geographically has then also divided out into two major groups along any number of very important lines. And so that might mean that, let's take that, for instance, the group that is in the heartland in rural America, they just tend statistically now to be far more Republican, far more conservative. They tend to, for instance, enjoy watching NASCAR a lot more. They tend to be connected to agriculture and perhaps blue collar jobs. They tend to be very much Christian and evangelical in their makeup. And they tends to be a very white, kind of homogeneous group. So that's the one group. And then if you look at the other group, they are distinctive along these very important lines, such that we've now created we've sorted into these massive groups. So already what we're thinking about now is, so we sorted into these two groups. They are radically different. We have to start thinking about group dynamics and group psychology. Because whenever human beings form themselves into groups, there are ways in which psychologists will show to us in all kinds of studies, we have a tendency to react and respond and act in particular ways. Sometimes those are good things. So sometimes they're for us to kind of shore up our group and to enjoy the company of like-minded people, for instance. But there are also like negative tendencies within that. So anytime you start to form groups, you start to get this us versus them mentality. You start to also get the second of the contours, and that is homogenization. And so what the research suggests is that already, because of sorting, you're going to get less and less diversity within these two groups, right? So, 10 people come together and they want to play football, for instance. So they join a group to play football. Let's say there's two of them there that, they kind of want to play soccer. Well, because there's not that many people that want to play soccer and the purpose of the group was coming together to play football, they're just not going to put forth their ideas to play soccer. And so in a sense, we withhold some of the diversity, whether it's a thought or opinions from that group. So there's a certain tendency to conform to the thinking and the acting of the particular groups that we're in. All of this goes back to this whole idea of group psychology, that kind of from the beginning of human beings, groups mean survival for us, right? So if you're embedded within a group, there's a greater chance that you're going to survive. If you start to lose membership in that group, or your group starts to be threatened from the outside, there are actually triggers inside of us as human beings that warn us, okay, so something's going on here. I need to adjust my behavior, maybe to mimic the behaviors of the group, or maybe I need to shore up and strengthen that group, or maybe I need to see another group as kind of my enemy, or perhaps even a threat, and so perhaps even punish or hate that group. So these group motivational behaviors are very strong with us in human beings. And so what we find is these groups are becoming more and more the same. And then there are outside influences, and I looked at a number of these throughout the book. So for instance, parties found that it was politically expedient to kind of bring all the people within the party in line. That is both the politicians, but also those who are voting. And so what they wanted to do is to make it so that we could go to the polls and not split ticket vote anymore. I'd go to the polls, for instance, say, I'm going to vote for an entire Democratic slate. They wanted to make it easy for us, right? So they're going to make their politicians kind of have the same ideologies, vote the same way on policy, so on and so forth. So already there's more homogeneity coming within our groups. And then just the last thing to say, the other types of medias that we watch, the kind of online social media that we're involved in, this keeps contributing to both sorting as well as homogenization, because the algorithms and the networks, they're kind of set up in such a way to keep giving us and feeding us the things that affirm the group to which we belong, and oftentimes do so in an uncritical light. And then oftentimes, paint the outside group as something that isn't even a temptation to us to want to get involved in, to even think about. because they're painted in such a way to be so radically different than who we are that we wouldn't even kind of mess around with it. So those are the two of those contours, and then the third, which gets the most exciting, maybe isn't even the right word, but at least it adds gasoline to the fire, to use a metaphor here, or it adds increased temperature to the hurricane, right? And that is intensification. And what that means is when we form these two groups, there is a deepening intensity of angst, uncertainty, and negativity felt within the people within their own groups, because they feel very much that they're being threatened by the outside group. And then there's an increasing intensity of the negativity that exists between the interactions between these two groups. And this intensification comes about from any number of ways within our society. Part of it has to do with the way groups function in themselves. Part of it has to do that politicians and also, network news, these folks know that if they want to get us animated, if they want to keep us watching, or if they want to get us involved in politics, if they intensify negativity that we are feeling, as well as the fear of the outside group, we're just statistically speaking more likely to get involved, or more likely to stay watching their particular news outlet.
I mean, that really, really describes it well. That sorting, that homogenizing, then people building a group think, and then that becomes intensified. And there's lots of people who have lots of reasons to want to intensify that. The religions that we come from, you as a father, me as an evangelical pastor, like, we lead communities, and we know, boy, there's just certain things that can motivate people. And I wish that all of our traditions shows the positive side of human engagement, interdependence and care and softness and inclusion. Those really are good organizing principles. And then there are others that also serve as organizing principles: fear and isolation and threat. Those also serve as pretty good ones. So can we just sort of, I don't know, talk pop philosophy for a bit here about this? Well, you don't have to, because you have a PhD in this stuff, so you can talk as an academic about this. But it does seem like we're that there are periods of time, and I feel like we're in one of those periods of time where we're missing leaders and icons calling for organizing around the better angels of our nature, right? And sometimes we've had those in groups and culture and society. We have always had the people who want to divide us. Like, there's no period of time where there weren't significant icons and leaders that were saying, we're better separate than we are together. But boy, it feels like globally, and in the United States especially, we're just missing these voices that are saying it would be better if we shared a common future. We don't have to have a shared narrative. We don't all have to come from the same background. We don't have to believe that there's a shared narrative. In fact, there's many different narratives. So we're not going to have, a shared narrative of the future, but we can have a shared future. We can have a narrative of a shared future. We can believe that there's a future that we can all live in together. And I don't know, like, those forces seem to be missing. I mean, there were times when there was clear battles going on, and there were people in our society who held those up. And there was a thought, and look, I mean, I'm not all for, the way, the Americana way that we told stories in America with a melting pot and all the rest. But people who talked about that stuff, like, we're all in this thing together, it's a big melt. They were trying to advocate for, having a dream that someday the things that divide us would be recognized as something that can also bring us together. You think about King, there are periods of time of separation and periods of time of togetherness. And it just feels like we're missing the big, bold voices saying, I don't know, not to be cheesy as a mid-50s-year-old guy, but, I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. It was like a Coca-Cola commercial from the 70s, there was a thing that was saying, hey, and all of that just sort of gets trampled on. And I don't know. You see what I'm getting at? Do you think about this at all? Like where are the leaders of our communities saying, wouldn't it be better if we were together on things, and I'm not talking about erasing people's histories and past and all that, but just a different narrative of kind of the project we're up to as human beings.
Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying, and would agree to an extent that there seem to be less voices today calling for deeper solidarity and
Mhm.
deeper unity among us as human beings within this particular cultural context of the United States. And I don't know exactly why that's the case. I do understand to some extent that uh, the polarized times in which we live make it quite risky and more difficult for leaders to stand above the fray, if you will, and call for unity. And actually, the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written on this a little bit, and says that, let's say we want to so-called cross over to another group to engage them, let's just say politically. He says, we might fear what we will encounter when we cross over to the other, for instance. But he said another thing that we fear is actually our own group, because
Yeah,
our own
yeah,
group, like kind of like the whole thing of crabs pulling themselves back down into the bucket, right? So our own group doesn't want to see people sort of
yes,
trying to reach across, because again, the idea is that we're feeling the uncertainty, we're afraid, and if one of our own tries to reach across and tries to unite, that might mean more uncertainty, or it might mean more change. And when you add more uncertainty to an uncertain time, it really creates a lot of anxiety. So people will often suffer from their own groups if they actually
yeah,
try to build a deeper sense of solidarity. So that, I think, philosophically and psychologically, that's some of what's going on. And Haidt is such a great voice today, I think, for these things. And then maybe just reflecting theologically and somewhat within the perhaps like the Catholic world.
hmm,
Um, Sometimes I think there is, I hear, let's just say, I hear from people when I'm talking to them about this particular topic that somehow it's a show of weakness to be a
yeah,
person who desires to deepen unity between human beings. And I find that kind of interesting. So I just finished teaching a course on ecclesiology at St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology. And so I came back to this point about what is the church over and over again with the students who were in the course, and they were wonderful students. And the whole idea that the church is, in Catholic terms, the universal sacrament of salvation. And well, what does that mean? It means it's the site where the unity that God desires between human beings and God actually exists, and it's also the source or the instrument that can bring that unity into the world. So at the most fundamental level, the church should be a site and should be an instrument for deeper unity. So if that's weak, well, then I think the church, maybe needs to re-understand herself in a different way. Like, I mean, that's the whole essence of the church, is to kind of recreate uh, through God's grace the unity that God desires. So that's kind of one point theologically, and another one would be, people will say, well, it's weak to kind of leave one's group to cross over and try to have a conversation or dialogue or deepen unity with the other. And I just, and I do this in the book, but I come back to Jesus. I mean, who should be like the epitome of what we are holding up as, the virtuous person, the strong person, if you will, the courageous person. Jesus was constantly sort of stepping out of his own,
hmm,
group, and within kind of the own sort of like the ideas that were culturally acceptable at his time, and stepping into the experience of the other, whether it was the demoniac or the leper or the so-called sinful person. I mean, Jesus's courage was exemplified in leaving and crossing over and
yeah.
doing so in a way where he put himself at risk, he put his own reputation at risk, and yet he did it because he knew this was somehow necessary for salvation, right? So I think Christianity has great resources, and I think also psychologically we have great resources to think about why it's so hard to be a voice today calling for unity, but of course it's so necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. We're in that holiday week, in a big portion of the Christian church that is going to celebrate Easter this week,
Yeah.
where you're reminded, and it got him killed, right? And that's how it's going to go. And Jesus says stuff like that, like, hey, and do you think that, people who have a prophetic call to say we should be in this thing together, that's wound people up on the wrong side of the forces that don't want that to happen. And that also continues. And that's one of the things that, like, it's easy to think that polarization is the thing that's dangerous and unity is the thing that's safe. The lived experience, though, of people has kind of been the other way around, right? Where, like, if you continue to include and continue to say there's a world of us and not just a world of us or them, that that can wind you up, in physical danger and or social isolation or something else. So it's not as if it's not difficult to do, but it's kind of seen as the simple, easy, trite thing, right? Like any of us who go around, especially in the religious world, they're like, look, I think humankind does better when we love and include. Just generally speaking, people are like, well, that's nice, but that's not an organizing principle, or that's just going to get you in trouble, or, your pacifism and your inclusion is just going to wind you up with nothing. And frankly, people have watched that happen in religious communities. So let's pivot here and talk a bit about the role that churches have played. Um, Many of our institutions and structures that people depended on 75 and 100 years ago have changed dramatically, right? The role of religious communities in our world aren't what they used to be for so many people. For a lot of people, religion was an ethnic and cultural enclave. It was a place where you could feel safe inside of your religious traditions. And your religious traditions were tied to your ethnic traditions. So churches would speak in certain languages and immigrants would go. That's still true in some of the immigrant communities where church plays that function. But now we're in the United States. We're into this long progress of generations past immigration period. So churches now don't play a role of cultural assimilation and cultural similarity. So people have to find other reasons to be a part of a church, right? So then religion itself and the content of religion and the ideas of religion start to become those things. And religion could be used, especially the Christian tradition, which I know well, so I'll speak more about that one than others. It does have a root narrative of, all of us, and we're all included, and God loves the world, and all the we should love one another. All of that is the core story. But to most people's religious experience, they see religion as something that they see their own religion as something that differentiates them from another religion. How do you think about that? And now you're from a Catholic tradition, so people should know, maybe if they can't recognize by the, by the collar, but you could be an Episcopalian, or in my world, you could be a
Yeah.
Methodist or something else too. Some people know the color differences on what your, what the color of the shirt or jacket is, and maybe they don't see the FR in front of your name as father. But from a Catholic tradition, sometimes Protestants are like, man, I like those Catholics because they have, they don't do all the denominational breaking that we do in the Protestant church. And it's true. But you do have these orders and you have different groupings within the Catholic Church. So I know that even Catholics can experience the same kind of, like, I'm with this group of Catholics and not that group, or I'm with this religious tradition and not with this religious tradition. How do you think about the role that religion can and should be playing in the lived lives of people in the United States?
So that's a kind of wonderfully kind of massive question to think about. And, I would just go back, first of all, to just revisit the point that I was making, that I believe at the very core of Christianity is this move to try to deepen unity between all people. Um, I would say, within the church, we understand ourselves to have the property of being one, right? So on both sides of that, it's cultivating unity within the community, and then it's an also cultivating unity with the whole world. And so I think you can do both of these. However, there's always that little bit of a difficult temptation or tendency that, if we cultivate unity within the group itself, let's say the visible church itself, then the way to do that is to kind of like do a sort of comparison with the other, right? So a comparison with them, or a contrast with the them, because there are ways to strengthen the cohesion of a group by creating a them, and social psychologists have demonstrated that all across the board. So the church has to constantly, I would say, sort of fight that tendency or resist that temptation
Yeah.
that she herself creates an us versus them mentality between the visible church and the world. One of the beautiful things that I felt happened in Catholicism, in such that it was deepened or perhaps better nuanced in the Second Vatican Council, which happened back in the 1960s, is that the church's ecclesiology started to articulate itself in this idea of ecclesial communion. So the whole
Mm-hmm.
sense of communion became a centerpiece for Catholic ecclesiology. And the way I at least tried to teach this and how I understand this is that now what the church is trying to do is constantly trying to say, look, where are the things that are good and true and beautiful all throughout the world in various groups of people, whether it's from a different religion, a different Christian denomination, from a group of people that perhaps considers themselves unaffiliated or atheists or agnostics. Where can we see the truth and beauty of goodness that God, in a sense, has helped them to cultivate in their own lives? Where can we affirm this? Where can we join with this? Where can we actually be better ourselves from learning from these groups of people? So that's my idea of how I understand Vatican II articulating an
Yes.
ecclesiology of communion. It is a certain inclusivity. Now, to be sure, I think the church can make distinctions, and there can be differences, and there will be disagreements, and there is the whole sense of like this whole idea of like who's in and who's out, in a sense, in the Catholic world when it comes to communion or the reception of the Eucharist. But nevertheless, there's always what I call an ecclesiological generosity. It's this idea that I want to go out to the
Mm.
other and engage the other and find where there is common ground, because the idea is God is working with all people. The Holy Spirit is working with all people. Grace is potentially active in every person's heart. And my job as a Christian is to rejoice in God's work. And if I
Yeah.
can join up with that, then that's a wonderful thing. And so that's what I think the church is to be about. As I note in the book, one of the kind of temptations today is the utilization of this culture war metaphor, and we can talk about that maybe perhaps
Yeah.
more later. That's one of the
No,
significant
let's talk about it
struggles.
now. Yeah. Yeah. Let's do it. All right. So can I tell you a little anecdote and as it's
Sure.
set up for this, the conversation about the war narrative that happens in culture wars and holy wars, and how that invokes religion and all. The work that we do at Vote Common Good puts us in conversation oftentimes with people who have a different political identity than we might. So we engage people who we think are changing their thoughts on religion. On politics, primarily because of their religion. So we work with people for whom their religious identity and their political identity at some point became wedded together in a way that they're no longer comfortable with. For a lot of people, that means, I was born Catholic or I was raised an evangelical, and so therefore I vote for Republicans.
Yeah.
Other people who are Catholic are like, no, I voted for Democrats since Kennedy. And like, we're always going to be Kennedy, right? But there's like a religious identity and a political identity, and the two become wedded together. And we know that causes a great level of strife and angst for people. Like they don't like that. And breaking apart identities is really hard, right? So that's the work we do. That puts us in conversation with all kinds of people who are in the midst of this. We were in Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area a couple of years ago, and we were trying to introduce Democratic candidates to evangelical and Catholic voters who they might have not otherwise had a chance to meet. So we were in a rally for a person running for Congress as a Democrat, and he was Catholic and very well known for being a Catholic. That meant that the organizers inside of Catholicism, who really opposed his view on abortion, especially, would troll him constantly. They would show up at his events and have signs and do protesting demonstrations. So that was going on. We're running a rally. We have a bunch of anti-abortion protesters at our event with signs, and we negotiated with them where they could stand and how they could be there. And we said, we're not here to shut you down, and we're hoping you're not here to shut us down. We'll be glad to listen to you, the things you have to say after we're done with the things we have to say. Since we organized this little get together, we could figure this out. So we negotiate a way to do it. One of the women who was organizing it, I was in a conversation with her, and we have these yard signs for the political season that say, I will vote faith, not fear, hope, not hate, love, not lies, right? It's this kind of sort of political looking yard sign. And then people put it next to whatever sign they want in their neighborhood. And it's a really positive message for people. Okay. So we're standing around, and I was saying to this particular person, hey, maybe we could find some levels of agreement, because you clearly are pro-life in your estimation because you're against abortion, but that probably also means you're going to be against the death penalty. And I don't want to assume, but I would think you would want to stop gun violence. And I think you'd want to stop wars and drone attacks and some of the more pacifist tendencies that I have. Right. And she said, no. And I don't think, being pro-life has anything to do with those issues. And we also had these Black Lives Matter signs in 2020 that we were traveling with. And she pointed at one of those signs and said, in fact, if you or any of your Black Lives loving friends tried to walk into my house without my permission, I'd shoot you dead with my gun myself. Right.
Man.
And then she said, but I really do like those faith, not fear, hope, not hate, love, not lies signs. Can I have one of those? And I said, well, actually, those come with a donation. You have to make a $25 donation for one of those. She goes, walks to her car, gets $25, comes back, gives us $25, and takes a yard sign home with her. And I thought, okay, so here we have this situation, right? We're both claiming faith motivation. She wants the same sign in front of her house: faith, hope, and love, not lies, hate, and fear. Right. She's going to put that in her front yard. I'm going to put it in my front yard. And yet she says, oh, I think you're such a threat that if you ever assaulted me, I would, use my Second Amendment rights to protect myself.
Yeah.
And it was just this clarifying moment of like, man, yes, we can find agreement on some things. But if we keep just simply saying, let's find more topical agreement, thinking that that's somehow going to lead to overcoming the isolation, I don't know that it is. So I tell that anecdote a lot because it's anecdote a lot. Sometimes in my mind, I confuse anecdote and antidote. That anecdote a lot, because am I not the only one? Because like, that's where people live, right? They'll be like, I totally get along. I'm doing something with people. We agree. Then you hit another topic and it's like, I can't even have lunch with you. I can't even talk to you about things. So I think we used to believe, hey, let's just find enough things to agree on, and those will stack up, and then we'll overcome the polarization. We both want our kids to have the same life. We want to soccer, whatever it is, I don't know. I just don't think that works. I don't think that's the lived experience. What do you think of all that? So, talk about any of that you want.
Yeah. So first of all, I think what a great thing that you're engaging in the work that you're engaging in. So it sounds like you're crossing over to groups that perhaps think differently or asking interesting questions, and they aren't necessarily groups of people that maybe other folks would be comfortable doing that. And you're trying to have like really important conversations. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And what a great thing too, that the person could at least be honest with you where she was coming from and how she was feeling. I don't know exactly how to kind of sort of bridge the challenge which you've just put forth there. On the one hand, I think there could be like a multiplicity of goals that we can hope to work on. And I think, one of the things that you mentioned, which is, let's try to see if there are agreements and ideas and policy and things like that. But in one sense, that might be maybe more superficial, because I think what happens is within the polarized hurricanes in which we exist, we are talking about the identities that we maintain. And identity is so much more than an idea. It goes to the very core and heart of who we are. And like you said, it is very difficult to change or to shift or to adjust an identity, because as some folks will say philosophically, you have to kind of rework your whole way of life, right? Imagine a person who finally decided that they needed to leave a particular network news station because they no longer agreed with it. Well, all of their friends and all of their connections and their whole lifestyle would be around that particular news station. So for them to kind of leave that job,
Yeah.
for instance, that employment, and pivot to something else, that's a whole change of identity. So I think we are talking about going into the very depths of changing our identities, and that's a very difficult thing to do. The other thing is we're not always so reasonable, and a lot of the research
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
polarization suggests that when identities are triggered, what happens is emotions can get in the way of us thinking clearly about our positions or our perspectives. So, for instance, like let's say a person is pro-life, to see the consistencies of what it would mean to be pro-life across the board, and yet when somebody's identity is triggered, then they start to feel the fear and the anger and the threat, and they don't perhaps realize that, well, now they've just sort of put aside the consistency in their thought process and utilize something else, and they don't even know it because they feel that threat on
Mm,
the
mm.
inside in a very profound way.
Yeah, boy, I think that's what we found too, is that it's an identity question. And look, any of us who are trying to figure out our identities and how we live in the world, it's really hard. And I do think there's a fragility that a lot of us feel about whatever social identity we're carrying with us in our lives now. I feel like I don't know how to describe it, but I just think that's one of the characteristics in the United States that we're struggling with and people are exploiting, and we're tending to fear those that we can't really fear, because the things that used to tell us that were identity markers of familiarity and trust and safety, those things are breaking apart.
Yeah,
Can I tell you one more story about this?
sure.
Back in 2017 or 2018, Donald Trump came to Minnesota where I live. He was touting the tax bill that they had passed. So he wanted to go in April to a factory to say like, hey, this factory wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for our tax deal, right? Which is just utter malarkey, because obviously the company was there. But it was the same period of time where he started to attack um, Ilhan Omar, who's my congresswoman, right? So she's from Minneapolis. So he was saying she should go back to where she came from. She's not a true American, all this stuff, because she's from Somalia. And so that caused this huge thing. So he comes to Minnesota, right? And is 30 miles south of Minneapolis in a small little area called Shakopee, right? Or 15 miles south of Minneapolis. And there's a small little road that runs up to this factory. So there are people lined up on one side of this little 2-lane road supporting Trump, as people would when the president they voted for comes to town. People are out there cheering him on. And then people supporting Ilhan Omar on the other side of the road. I had a radio show at the time, so I was moving back and forth across the road, interviewing people on both sides. Like, what are you experiencing? And what I heard from people on both sides of the road, they would look across this little 2-lane road. So you're talking 15 feet, 18 feet over there, they'd point and say, I have no idea who those people are.
Mm,
Now, these are all people that live within driving distance, and at 2:00 on a Tuesday could be standing out there, like, same area. They care enough about so many things in common, but they're literally looking across an 18-foot chasm and saying, I have no idea who those people are.
yeah.
And that reality that we live, and I had that experience with my neighbor who I knew for a long, long time, and a whole lot of political things happened, and she moved one way around Trump and I moved the other way, and we would see each other and just be like, oh my gosh, now I just don't know. And that was an identity question, right? Because the question wasn't, I'm concerned about, I don't know who you are. It's, I don't know who I am now in relationship to you. Right. Sort of Martin Buber, I thou stuff, like this identity thing. It's not just you're confusing to me. It is, I am confused about how I'm supposed to live in the world at this point. Do you think that's generally
Yeah.
true as well? That we're just living in this fragility of not knowing who these people are that we used to think we could trust. And we're just like, honestly, I have no idea how you make sense of the world anymore.
Yeah, so I think you nailed a very important point, and I try to work as best as I can through in the book through this idea of identity, and I keep coming back to it. And really, since I've been working on my dissertation and studying the challenge of secularization, which is a different issue but interrelated to polarization, one of the struggles that we realize is that people today living in the Western world struggle with the idea of identity, and that is really answering the question like, who am I? And so what I talk about is that creates this ground of fragility on which we stand. And so when I don't know who I am, that makes me feel uncertain. It makes me feel nervous. It makes me feel somewhat desperate, right? Because I don't have that deep sense of meaning in purpose. And we know that those things are, in one sense, kind of necessary for survival. Some Viktor Frankl would say that it's more important than water and food and shelter. That whole sense of who I am. Now, there are all kinds of cultural situations that exist which create this sense of a lack of identity. And I use the work of Zygmunt Bauman, for instance, and his notion of liquid modernity, where
Mm.
groups and structures all around us are liquefied, and that strong identity which we used to be able to stand upon is no longer strong. It's not given to us. And so one of the tasks that Bauman and also like Francis Fukuyama will say, one of the tasks of modern people is that we have to form and create our identity all the time.
Yeah.
And they'll use the word desperation, that we actually try to form our identity out of desperation, because to not know who one is a very challenging place to be. Now, one of the things that we do is we will latch on to particular groups, particular people, to help us to form our identity, which is completely normal, So like family can provide that to an extent, and maybe the work environment, or maybe our political party, and maybe our religion, and all that's good. So we can find a sense of who we are. But there's a danger there, because once we find something that shores up our identity, because we're in a fragile period and an uncertain time, we hold on to that with a strength that in other times we just simply wouldn't do, because we're so afraid of losing it. Because in a sense, it's like we're in a desert trying to find water, and water is our identity. We finally find a source of water, and we remember what it's like to be thirsty, and we don't want to go back to it. So now, going to your point, I look across the road, and here's this other group of people. And in my mind, for whatever reason, because of the polarized situation that we are in, they seem to be a threat. For whatever reason, like even though they seem to have things in common, which I would totally agree with you, they seem to be a threat. And the thing that they're threatening is the very identity which I have now created. And I do not want to go back to the desert, right? I'm scared of going back to the desert, and I feel like they could potentially put me into the desert. Now, what we realize, and if we do a lot of the things that I talk about in the book, which is we do the crossing over, if we do engage with those who are different, we actually can find that they will be a source of water for us as well. So that's what I think, which you point out, which is great. We sort of are brainwashed, if you will, because of group dynamics and polarization and so many other things, to think that we don't have anything in common with the other. And in fact, people do studies and say our perception of the other group is actually way off mark, whether that's Democrats or Republican group. We think things that are just simply not true about the other group, which I find kind of humorous and sort of fascinating in one hand, but it's also, I guess, sort of tragic too. But what we realize is that, oh my gosh, when I'm with this other person, I see that I have a shared humanity. I see that they actually have a family. They care about their kids. They really just want to work. And most people just want to get by. I mean, they want some stability in their life. And all of a sudden we start to realize, oh my gosh, we actually care about the same things. We maybe disagree about how to get there. But look, now that we have this like basis of like common agreement and understanding, I think that we can actually move and work with that. I think that actually really makes a difference. And a lot of times people in the work of psychology call this contact theory, such that, when you come in contact with somebody who's the perceived other or different, what we find is that, you find a shared humanity, and you can actually move forward with that, where prejudice is actually lessened and unity is actually deepened.
Yeah. And at the same time, some of these greatest conflicts happen amongst the people we know the best, right? I mean, look, family violence, domestic violence is the primary means of violence in our society, sadly. It's the way most people who are harmed by one another. Many killings in the United States, unfortunately, happen either as self-inflicted or upon a loved one. So there's something also about like our ability to self-harm as human beings, which is so curious. And that familiarity can be this, an experience and exposure can be something that really does break open this stranger fear, stranger danger that, we try to teach children to overcome at a certain developmental stage.
Yeah.
And then there's some of these things that are so core rooted. And unfortunately, the religious narratives, and we'll talk for a few in our final minutes here about this war narrative and holy war narrative. Oftentimes that stuff is most intense within religious communities, right? Like like there are people, and I was with a person who runs an organization called Hindus for Human Rights, and she talks about the pain within the Hindu community and how they're turning on one another. And a friend who works with Muslims for progressive values and sees it within Islam, and people who see it within Buddhism, where Buddhists are turning against one another, and certainly within the traditions of Christianity that I'm familiar with. Like it's a shared frustration with those closest to us. So sometimes this polarization is those who, like I was saying, like looking across the street, I have no idea who you are, and other times it's, oh, I know exactly who you are, and this war is internal within the family or within the community. And certainly that's been true in the Catholic Church. I mean, sometimes Catholics don't even worry about non-Catholics, right, in the holy war narrative. Like they're just simply going after other Catholics. And there's, for people who don't know it, there's huge rifts within the Catholic Church, and this sort of subtle war that's going on, which is also political and, like electoral politics, governmental politics as well. Steve Bannon's a big part of a lot of that stuff, a lot of these groups that form up. Can you talk a little bit about that, if you want to talk about it from the Catholic situation as well, or if you want to be more general, but this kind of internal warring that goes on that somehow gives rationale and excuse for people's separation from one another, and not just polarization, but really the need to exterminate ideas that they don't believe are worthwhile.
Yeah. So this touches, I think, a very kind of sensitive place in a lot of people's lives. When I'm writing the book and I start to turn my attention onto the church and onto Christians, I know I'm kind of walking on holy ground for a lot of people. And obviously the Christianity and the churches, that is a holy ground for me. I have given my life to that, and it's part of my own identity. So it's very much important to me. So I walk with sensitivity here. It's also partly that breaks my heart because, going back all the way to the writing of St. Paul, there was this constant emphasis on, look, we've now been united in Christ, and we share these baptismal bonds. And this identity that we have now in Jesus and the bonds that we share are to be the most important things in our lives. And we should recognize that we're united together because of what Jesus has done. And we're united together in our faith and our hope and our love. And we should never take this for granted. And we should try our best to cultivate this unity which has been given to us as a gift. So I just see how important that unity is. And so then when I see it strained, when I see some of the divisiveness and the vitriol that's shared, even within the Catholic world itself, between Catholics, it kind of breaks my heart, actually, in many ways. I really hope that in writing the book that I find kind of ways that give people tools to sort of overcome some of this. And one of the things that I look at and I try to analyze in the book is how within in the Catholic world, but in the Christian world in general, what kind of began as this whole idea of a culture war, and that we were engaged in a political cultural war. It began somewhat on the right in conservative circles, but I think the left and the right are both guilty of kind of utilizing this narrative. So that political cultural war was then brought into the church, and I show this in more detail in the book. And then it's been utilized by both politicians, but then also churchmen and church leaders, church women, to try to motivate people not just to engage politically or culturally, but even to engage in the task of evangelization or the task of mission. And so I try to look at and analyze, so why is this challenging? Well, the first thing is that metaphors are super powerful.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of writing on metaphors. They form our vision for reality. They help us ask certain questions. They oftentimes impede us from seeing the truth of the reality around us. But within the war metaphor, and I'm just speaking of the metaphor here, what often is done is that we paint the other as the enemy without exception. Yep. And then when we look at the engagement that the war metaphor invites us to consider, when the other's the enemy, I want to either keep distance between myself and them, or I want to lob verbal bombs, for instance. I want to set mind traps in my syllogisms, I want to make them look bad, so on and so forth. So this imagery of the war metaphor, I think, has kind of creeped into the language and the ideas and the metaphors used by the church. And it just seems to me now, I understand why it's so enticing and intoxicating, and I talk about that in the book. It just seems to me, though, and I try to show this going back to Jesus, like going back to the example of Christ, he really was presenting a different kind of
Yeah.
metaphor for Christians to consider. And Paul's words here are, I think, apt. Paul says that we are to have the same mind as Christ. And I say the metaphor for us to live by is Jesus's incarnational movement. And basically, what I mean by that is when the Son of God in the imminent Trinity, if you will, looked upon the world and saw all of the disasters and the struggles, and of course, there was wonderful things, but there were a lot of what we've talked about, all of these struggles. God did not see us as enemies.
Hmm.
God did not see us as something to destroy or to put distance, but actually, God chose to unite himself more intimately with us, to stand more in solidarity with us through the incarnation. God crossed over in order to bring about our salvation, to reunite us as human beings together and also with God. And so we see throughout Jesus's entire ministry is this ministry of crossing over, of walking into the
Hmm.
storm, if you will, all around him and trying to unite people together. And he would challenge people at times, which is understandable. And I think we need to do the same. But we're called to cultivate a sense of intimacy with the
Hmm.
other, right? A moving close
Hmm.
to the other. So I try to present this whole other way of thinking about the polarized age in which we live. And I do so talking about Christ's incarnational movement.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. And that book is called, I'm going to get it, Christ, our church's mission in a polarized world. It came out in February. Father Aaron, thanks so much for being in this conversation. If people want to keep this conversation going with you, what's the best way to do it? Obviously, they can go to the places where you buy books. I saw it on Amazon, so I'm sure it's there and in other places as well. How else can they keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so if they visit our website, the community I belong to, it's called glenmary.org, GLENMARY.org. They'll find more information about Glen Mary and some of the things that I'm involved in, and they'll find a way to contact me if they desire to have more conversations around this topic. So thank you so much, Doug. It's been
Yeah.
great.
What is Glen Mary? I'm unfamiliar with that. Is that an order? Is that what is it?
Yeah, technically it's a Society of Apostolic Life, but basically it's a religious movement.
Okay, that's great. Hey guys, technically it's a Society of Apostolic Life. Now there's a phrase that not
I
every
know,
non-Catholic gets to use on a regular basis.
but exactly. That's why I don't really use it, but it's an order. It's a religious order. And our
Okay.
task is to go to rural, poor areas throughout Appalachia and the Southeast that don't have a lot of Catholic presence, and really to live among the people there and to bring the gifts of the Catholic
Hmm.
Church and to build relationships with non-Catholic Christians, but with all the people in order to try to bring the kingdom of God as best we can.
Oh, that's really, really great. So if people live in other places outside of, I don't know, Appalachia, they're still welcome to follow what you're doing and be part of it. I
Absolutely. That
mean,
would be
and I guess I don't have to join the Society of Apostolic. What was it? The Society of Apostolic
life. Yeah.
Life, the Society of Apostolic Life. But do people join it? Like, do regular people just say like, "Hey, no, I orient myself inside of this community of people"?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have priests, we have brothers, we have sisters, we have lay people, and all of us are joined together in what we call this kind of family of Glen Mary. And people utilize our spirituality, our charism to live their lives in a missionary sense, and also to serve the people around them and to reach out to the poor and try to deepen actually the unity that Christ desires. So yeah, it's open to
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah, that's really great. Okay, so people can find it at glenmary.org. Oh, Dan's doing some magic with the camera there to get that there,
Sorry.
glenmary.org. And you can find Father Aaron's contact information and all of that there. And of course, you can pick up the book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World. So, hey, thanks again. We'd love to stay in touch with you and keep this work going.
Thanks for all your work too. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Hey, thanks. All right, y'all. Hey, we'll be back tomorrow. 10 o'clock. No, earlier time. And people sometimes in the comments, Father Aaron, they say things like, "I'm not sure when you guys are on," because Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays we're on at different times. So people are constantly like, I don't know, it's a Where's Waldo moment. People trying to
Yeah.
follow it when we're gonna pop up live. So we try to keep people up on that, but we'll be on earlier tomorrow. Dan, do we know yet what time we're on tomorrow on Thursday for just the randoms?
I think we're at 9 a.m. Eastern time.
9 a.m. Eastern.
With astrophysicist Paul Wallace.
Yeah, we have a regular conversation with an astrophysicist on Thursday, so that's dictated by a teaching schedule for him. So anyway, we're on a variety of times on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. But Father Aaron, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank
All
you.
right, y'all. Hey, we'll see y'all tomorrow, 9 a.m.